The Nature of Military Medicine, a 37-minute presentation held at the Allenbrook Lecture Theatre in the Joint Services Command Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 3rd of June 2008. The speaker is Major General Alan Hawley, OBE QHP, Director General Army Medical Services.
Military medicine isn't what it used to be. Things have changed. There's a new set of realities knocking around the world. And frankly, there's an education process to go through here. Last week I was at the Army Development Forum. This was headed up by CGS and C&C, looking at the future, at where we see the Army being and how we should be configured for the land component side of this from sort of 10 years onwards. Fascinating. I mean, really worthwhile stuff. Some excellent stuff being banged down the range. But what struck me was that we were still talking in terms of combat arm, combat support, and combat service support. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that, for me, is yesterday. What we should be talking about is capability package, and defining that capability package in terms of the political effect we are trying to achieve. And that's a completely new mindset. For the Army, those of you in khaki will know that this is particularly difficult because it runs counter to every regimental fibre in our bodies, because we ain't interested in that. It's how we're going to group a whole different set of different cap badges together to give us a desired effect. It's, I believe, a new way to handle this. Now, historical trends. A lot of this is pretty obvious, but it's worth stating because we tend to have, the arrogance of the retrospectoscope. What we have now is exact. Looking back, wasn't Field Marshal Haig a little dim? Well, I'd suggest to you he wasn't. Wasn't Marlborough all-knowing? I'd say to you he wasn't. But the retrospectoscope gives those certainties. The relationship, therefore, between medicine and the military has changed fundamentally, and I'll illustrate that as we go on. There are different ways of looking at this. One is medicine as applied to the warrior, however you want to define warrior, whether he's going to be a Taliban fighter down in Helmand or whether he's going to actually be part of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. So the warrior, what do you do there? And that's the classic role of military medicine. Actually, it's the same in the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy as well. It's all about force protection. There's medicine and the non-warrior, whatever that might mean. That means that part of the battle space which isn't actually involved in direct conflict, but may itself be subject to it. Vulnerable groups, men, women, pregnant, lactating women, the young, the traditional, since the Second World War anyway, preferred target groupings in asymmetric warfare. And then there's the indirect effects of war on the population. If you think of days gone by, the civilian population actually were fair game. They were the means by which you drew sustenance in order to continue a campaign. Or they were part of the reward for winning a campaign. What is, I think, particularly discouraging is since the Berlin Wall came down, I think there's been a re-emergence of that approach, particularly in some parts of the world, Africa in particular. And therefore the effects of war can be indirect. Historically, they've been communicable disease, famine, migration, and you see all of that now going on in different parts of the world. It was astonishing to me, for instance, that when we started to bomb in the Balkans, we were somehow caught on the hop when the population moved. It was entirely reasonable, because why the hell would you stay there? The fact we bombed them, fine, no different from Genghis Khan in a sense. It's violence being targeted, indirect effect of warfare. And that, of course, in terms of military medicine, is an additional challenge. Communicable disease and population movement are always worrying because you lose the infrastructure. So where have we come from? How do you cover 5,000 years of recorded history? Well, I've just taken snapshots. I do some lectures on war and medicine, and so I've just pulled out one or two things from this. Sumeria. One of the early civilizations. Actually, when you look at some of the Sumerian work there, they actually had military doctors as part of their force, but those doctors were priests as well. I draw a contemporary analogy, personally, as a spiritual healer as well as a physical healer. As a consultant, as a professor of medicine, I regard myself as on that sort of plane. So Samaria actually had a military medical service. That was equivalent and a reflection of civilian practice. So it was in Egypt. Two sorts of doctors in Egypt. One with a priesthood, and the others were the jobbing doctors, if you like. Exactly the same, and they were shown in the Egyptian army. Exactly the same. So already we have a trend here that civilian professional development is reflected in the military structures. Now, I'm not going to bang on too much because the other 2 points there, Rome clearly shows that quite nicely. An established military service, doctors actually being NCOs in the Roman army, so they didn't get everything right. And the age of chivalry, again, showed the 2 grades of doctor. A physician who dealt with nobility, and a jobber, the early barber surgeon, who dealt with those who were not nobility. Those 4 points, therefore, make, for me, the case that military medicine is nothing different from civilian medicine in the way that that profession is reflected in its own organisation. It's just the same. But we come on now to the rise of science, and of course, the Enlightenment and tipping into the early 1800s, the rise of science as a corpus of knowledge. The time when actually one man couldn't know it all. That knowledge had grown so much that specialization came in. Science was all that flowed from that. And it inevitably tipped into that 6th bullet, medicine as a profession. Because as you get a special corpus of knowledge, of expertise, that gives you the foundation for a profession. And the 1800s saw that flowering. We saw the empowering of Royal Colleges, the beginning of the profusion. As you know, the Royal College of Physicians was founded 200 years before that. College of Surgeons in England at 1800 came from the barber surgeons in the City of London. That's not an accident. That reflects the broader epistemology that was going on in society. I've chosen tropical medicine as an illustration here of the utility of medicine. Tropical medicine did not exist as a specialty until about 1880. In 1880, it became established. The London School of Tropical Medicine, of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, was founded around about then. The Liverpool School shortly before it, in fact. Why? Why on earth, if you're sitting on an island like this today, with the weather that you've seen outside, are we interested in this? Well, the answer is empire. That's why. It's manpower conservation. This is not an act of philanthropy. This is an investment in colonial power. West Africa was the white man's grave. We've got to do something about that. We can't have regiments disappearing. We can't have administrators that we put out there and we invested heavily in keeling over. Tropical medicine was an attempt to do that. In other words, it became a pillar of state power. Now, the spin-off, actually, was that there were wider benefits for other populations. But let's not lose sight of the fact that the prime mover was to do with state power. Ballistics and surgery. This had been going on for some time. But with the growth of science, with the growth of mathematics and physics in particular, and then the whole question of chemistry, we began to have the first professor of military surgery, a chap called Longmore, who wrote a definitive book on gunshot injuries and their treatments, who was the first guy to tease out all the physics of ballistics. Now, you don't need me to tell you what's different about a high-energy transfer wound, what's different between that and a low-energy transfer wound or a stabbing. But it fundamentally changed practice. And since gunpowder came in, military surgery was different from civilian surgery, because gunpowder gave that extra muzzle velocity which required a different way of treating. And ballistics was the final flowering of that sort of corpus of knowledge. Sadly, in the world we are today, I think there's a coming together of that the profusion of high-velocity weapons, drug wars and all the rest of it, and organised crime, means that some of those wounds we only saw in the battle space are now seen routinely in the great cities of the West. But we live with the legacy of the 20th century. We could say Blackadder lives on. The popular experience of World War I and World War II, think there's a very respectable case to be made, actually, that National Health Service was born of expectations and engendered in World War I. Not World War II. World War II was the final flowering of that. But for people who hadn't got access to healthcare, suddenly find that they would be treated in the First World War on the basis of clinical need was revolutionary. So that's a positive thing here. That at the point of need, you would be treated on clinical priorities, full stop, bust. And the same with World War II. Well, so what? That is very much a view of medicine which is trauma-centred. For the first major campaign in history, it was the Western Front, where the proportion of deaths from injury were higher than from disease. It wasn't true in Gallipoli, it wasn't true in Palestine, it wasn't true in Mesopotamia or Africa, but it was true on the Western Front. The other thing that happened in World War I in particular was the organisation. It's fantastic to think on the first day of the Somme, with that dreadful experience, you could get wounded soldiers back from the Somme into Charing Cross Hospital within 24 hours. Just think of the logistics of that. There's no Royal Air Force air evac available. This is all train and ship and train again. But a wonderful feat of organisation. Now, all of that has fed into the Army Medical Services regulations, which says, it still does today, first role of the Army Medical Services is the maintenance of health and prevention of disease. I agree entirely. I don't think that's changed at all. Then goes on to talk about collection, treatment and rehabilitation of the injured. Absolutely. Again, clearly that has to be important to us, is what we're doing now for soldiers, sailors and airmen in all the operational theatres. So that hasn't changed. But what I suggest to you is that things have moved on. We're beyond that point. Nature of conflict changed. Well, my goodness, this is the sort of place where you would sit and debate that for some time. Has the nature of conflict changed? Let us, for the purpose of this, accept the thesis that the expression of operations has changed somewhat. And let's say it goes back to 9/11. I think there's a very tight intellectual case for saying it goes beyond that. But for the purposes of today, let's just ride with that one. Has medicine changed? Yes. Fundamentally, it has changed. We now have soldiers who have had 80% burns, who would have died 5 years ago, who are now surviving, coming back, and we are growing a new skin for them from stem cells. It's fundamentally changed in that sense. We're just beginning to see the beginning, I think, of the stem cell revolution and where that's going to take us. And has the significance of casualties changed? Well, most of us will say, based on the first Gulf War, yes. And it's not just our casualties. You'll remember the dreadful scenes of catching the Republican Guard on their withdrawal from Kuwait. And the effect that had in terms of death, and particularly difficult because they were air-delivered destruction, but the effect that had, the reality of war shoved into people's faces. And that's enemy casualties. Own casualties, of course, there's a certain sensitization to it. Well, I don't want to overplay that, because I think actually there's a difference between different Western nations. But I do think the significance of casualties has changed, and it drives forward certain political perceptions as well. So those are, I think, some contemporary realities. And what does that mean? Well, I used the expression that General Rupert Smith uses, war amongst the people. I think we have a counterinsurgency tradition here. I'll talk more of that a little bit later. But I do think that somehow that counterinsurgency tradition is particularly apposite when we look at what we're involved in now and what we're likely to be involved in. I'd also say to you, I'll link it into the third point then, Van Creveld, the revolution in military affairs. And Van Creveld, remember, they all start at the end of the First Gulf War. He represented a view that actually the revolution in military affairs was based on an inappropriate understanding of the nature of states and state power in the contemporary world. But actually, the West was too focused on interstate warfare, on a Clausewitzian Trinitarian view of the political reality, and that the world wasn't going to be like that. That we would have failed states, we would have non-state players. It was enormously more nuanced, sophisticated and complex than that traditional view. He may well be right. General Rupert Smith at the bottom, I think his book, Utility of Force, which some of you may have seen, I think plays nicely into those 2 points, a counterinsurgency tradition and Van Creveld's view of political realities. I think the war amongst people fits nicely with both of those sort of strands. But the second point, 1990s, there was a cosy consensus, led, I think, by many NGOs. You remember that the number of NGOs, there were no NGOs until the UN was formed, 1947, 48. And there's a steady increase until the Balkan Wars. And then there's an exponential increase. That I don't think is by accident. That exponential increase led to complexity. And it led to the question of what is it that the military do and what is it that the NGO community should do. So the concept of humanitarian space came up. And how you define that is interesting. And I would personally say to you, it's rather than a geographical concept, it's a psychological concept. It's where non-military actors feel themselves able to deliver humanitarian assistance. Now, there may be a geographical component to that, but I think it's largely a psychological and perceptual thing. And there seemed to be a consensus at the end of the 90s, based on the Balkans, based on Kurdistan, based on Rwanda, based on one or two other things, that the military's role was just to guarantee that humanitarian space and the NGOs would get on and deliver humanitarian assistance. It's my view that was always flawed. That was never the reality. It just happened to fit those two constituencies' needs at that moment in time. But in terms of intellectual rigour, it doesn't make any sense at all. Why? If we are committed to development, and remember DFID is all about development, that is a political process. Because by its very nature, it's transformative. And we always teach, do we not, that humanitarian assistance, the emergency response, merely sets the conditions for development to continue or to roll on. Therefore, it becomes a precondition for development and therefore is part of a political process. Let's not go into all the other political contexts which define this. So that cosy paradigm for me was never intellectually rigorous and now has little sense at all in the post-9/11 world. So what does that mean for us? Well, I would say that in military medicine, those first two bullets are still extant. Prevention of disease, maintenance of health, collection, treatment, rehabilitation of the injured. Absolutely. But there are two additional ones. First one is improvement in performance. Now that could be all sorts of levels. It could be the individual level by better training regimes, the use of drugs in aircrew to prolong aircrew hours or performance. Remember there were some ill-fated attempts at this in the Second World War using amphetamines. There's a little more science to it now. And the last one is medicine itself as a capability package. That, I think, is absolutely critical, and that's where we really need to go. What do I mean? Well, I said I'd come back to counterinsurgency. Let's look at that. Malaya and Dhofar, classic, successful counterinsurgencies in which medicine as a package was folded into a complete strategy in both of those. Different matters of scale, and some of the details were different, but the overall approach was the same. A unified aim to which everything was subsumed. Political, military, legal, police, infrastructure, including medical. That whole business. You reward loyalty, you deny the goods of the state to those fighting against it. And by so doing, you wear down that insurgency. You drain the water in which these fish swim, to pursue a Maoist analogy. Malaya and Dhofar, classic examples. Less efficiently done, I'd say, in Cyprus and Kenya. But, interesting. We do have examples here. Rwanda, 1994. Those of you who know me would know I could not give a lecture without reference to Rwanda in 1994. What did we do there? One of the principles that NGOs work on is independence and promoting independence in a target population. What we did in Rwanda in 1994 was completely the opposite. We had 1.5 million refugees in the humanitarian protection zone, and when the French pulled out in August 94, the worry was that would stampede those 1.5 million Hutu refugees, and they'd go down the one road into Zaire, as was, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we'd have a second Goma. How do you stop that? Well, by promoting dependence upon you. And we use medicine to do that, to reassure and to promote dependence. And by so doing, get control of population movement and provide stability. Once you've got that, you can then tip into the next stage, which is promoting independence and development. But it was a deliberate tactic, one that the NGOs were pretty unhappy about. Kabul 2001, 2002 was exactly the same. We used medicine in Kabul then specifically to get support for President Karzai and the interim administration before the lawyer Jirga in 2002, end of 2002. Deliberately targeted poor areas of Kabul that were anti-IA and put in clinics. Reformed the health sector so people could see there was benefit in moving to the interim administration's view of the world. The comprehensive approach in Afghanistan. Now it strikes me the comprehensive approach is an attempt to encapsulate many of the bits and pieces we had before, but without the benefit of a proper unified strategy. It's a cross-government, cross-agency attempt to bring coherence to what is inherently a difficult process. I think the jury's out as to how effective this is. I mean, I've heard voices on both sides saying actually very limited or very useful. I think it depends on your perspective. What it isn't, it ain't a Malayan strategy. It ain't a Dhofar strategy. It certainly isn't that. So that's why I put just a little question mark over the comprehensive approach and our current position in Afghanistan. Because I think in terms of medical capability, and medicine as a capability package, there is a role to be played here, a real role. I think modern military medicine does represent a new capability because we know we can measure the effect we're having, and indeed you are required to. You know that if you do this, you can reduce maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, all that sort of stuff. These are measurable outcomes from an input that has to be useful, particularly as part of an overall political strategy. Our current view, I think, is operationally impoverished. I don't think we are making best use of this capability. And I go back to what I spoke about earlier, the Army Development Forum. I don't think we've actually woken up to this yet in the Army. We are still talking in traditional terms. We're still talking kinetic means here, instead of political effect that comes from capability packages, which may well include or be led by kinetic at some stages, but non-kinetic at others. We are talking multi-agency, and I'm not talking here just NGOs, I'm talking international governments. Our own government across Whitehall. Clearly the Department of Health has resources, DFID has expertise, it's knitting all that together, which isn't necessarily easy. The development of military medicine in its full potential, I think, fits that last bullet. It reflects a combination of strategic / tactical circumstances and developments within science. And that, for me, is, if there is such a thing as lessons from history, and I'm not sure there are, if there's something I take from historical development, that is it. That is where we are and where we're likely to be in the future.
Major General Hawley answered the following 7 questions. Question 1. In your opinion, serious investment is needed in Army and Defence medical services as a whole. Are you the only voice calling for this?
One of the things that flows out the Army Development Forum work is exactly that next stage. What are the investment priorities now? This is a debate that's live. CGS has kicked it off. We've got the first tranche through. We've got a really good way forward now. The detailed arguments will now kick in. What does that mean in terms of balance across the Army against a set of assumptions to do with resource levels in the future? I think there will be some difficult decisions to be had. I think that's absolutely right. If you ask me my view at the moment, it is that I would like to have a small regular component of some of these areas, but with sustainability being embedded in the reserves, so that we can have a high readiness response. Because let's face it, all our experience has been, since the first Gulf War, that we do this. And each time we go, we deny we're going to do it. And those medics here will know exactly what I mean. I couldn't believe in 1994, when I went to Rwanda, for instance, that I was told repeatedly by MOD, you were not going to be treating refugees. I find that an astonishing thing to say. In the middle of genocide, with population movement of 2 million people going all around you, that you can put up a red cross and somehow be immune from this. That, I think, is changing. I have to say, I think this debate is being led very ably by the Americans, who are going through exactly this discussion now and talking in terms of capability packages and non-kinetic plays and non-kinetic effects and multi-agency. And I think we are moving that way.
Question 2. If the military offer medical services to civilians, the field hospitals don't have modules for paediatrics, etc. How do you resource that type of requirement? And how do you then prioritise military casualties?
We clearly haven't got it right at the moment. Look at Afghanistan, look at bed occupancy rates there. If we take Afghanistan as an example, it strikes me that one way to do this, because the comprehensive approach isn't necessarily giving us the results we need tactically. And that's another philosophical issue, which I've not touched on. But does DFID, with its remit, with its professional expertise, is it best placed to be part of the tactical response? And there's probably evidence that they're not. That their view is more strategic and a development issue. Whereas if you are a commander on the ground, what you want is part of the campaign strategy for this medical capability package, part of your line of ops, with a clear endpoint and deadline and targets and all the rest of it. What I'm not suggesting to you is the military can do this alone. In Afghanistan, for instance, the only solution which I think makes any sense is an Afghan solution, a national solution. But we have a role, I believe, in helping them to develop that. And so I could see, and we've stumbled on it in Iraq, if we'd actually read Northwest Frontier, we'd have realised we were doing this some time before, that a national response with the advice coming from us and pump priming resources coming from us, and I'm not talking through DFID, I'm talking through the military, is probably the way to do it. Because then you tie it in to the operational commander's line of ops. It's part of his campaign strategy. This isn't something we're doing as active philanthropy. This is tightly knitted in with clear endpoints, with clear targets. And that has to be. If we don't achieve that, then we are in danger of throwing money away.
Question 3. Medical ethics direct treatment to clinical need, but the social environments that we now operate in are different to what we were brought up in. Is it ethically sustainable for military medics to deliver care outside clinical needs and be more concerned with political influence?
I personally have no difficulty with that within limits. It's always been my contention that I'm most useful to the army because when I'm in it, but not necessarily of it, a bit like padres really, when I can actually say, stop, I actually think this isn't right. So from a moral point of view, that's an important posture to take. And I think it's one of those roles I didn't expand on, but which is really quite important to medical services. In terms of ethics, there's need wherever you look in a place like Afghanistan. And if you are working within Helmand province, I don't have a difficulty in targeting that need along the lines that I've said. It would be completely different if you were targeting resources to a political elite and denying them to the impoverished and the poor, the vast masses. I think that's a different kettle of fish, but I see no evidence that that's ever going to be our strategy, quite the reverse. So I do take your point, and I think there are limits, but the limits will be defined by the circumstances in which you find yourself. Difficult at this stage to come up with an example that would illustrate that, but I think they are there. I myself had no difficulty, again, in Kabul 2001-2002, in setting up clinics in areas where there was some suspicion, if not frank hostility, to President Karzai's interim administration, in order to win over the support of the elders. One of the things they wanted me to do was only to treat the men and the boys. And we refused. We said, no. We will treat the men and the boys on Tuesday and the women and the children on Thursday. So you don't mix the two. But we are not going to be part of that. Why? Because that's not President Karzai's view of Afghan society is aiming to build anyway. He wants a far more human rights approach to society, where your gender is not such a defining characteristic as it currently is in those parts. There's all sorts of other ethical issues that fall out of that, cultural imperialism and sustainability and all that sort of stuff. But I'm personally quite happy with that as an approach.
Question 4. With regard to military humanitarian intervention, using medical capability as a non-kinetic weapon, as we take this forward, should we disconnect the humanitarian part from the effect that we want to achieve?
Can you do that? Look at the tsunami. What made the tsunami relief work? It was the American carrier fleet in the Indian Ocean, providing command and control, which no one had. American carrier fleet. Why did Burma not allow US, UK and French navies to get involved in the Irrawaddy? Because I don't believe you can take the politics out of this at all. Hence my earlier point. Therefore, I never have accepted the NGO purist view that humanitarian assistance is something which is apolitical, independent of means, neutral, impartial. I just don't buy it, because it's not the world in which I live. I live in the world of political action, political circumstances, political consequences. And a disaster is no different. For instance, New Orleans, the richest nation in the world, had a problem responding adequately in time to the hurricane in New Orleans. Was that a political thing? Were there political consequences? Definitely. There still are. So I don't necessarily buy that distinction.
Question 5. The delivery of medical effect that the military want to achieve is influence on the ground. The developers see the delivery of medical effect differently, yet stabilisation is the end goal of everybody. Would this be resolved if a medic had a space on the board at the stabilisation unit?
That's a debate that we're now kicking off on, isn't it? Do we want a special unit to do this, a civil affairs type, however you want to define that, whatever capabilities you want to put in that? Or do we have a small specialist staff who can draw on the capabilities in the order of battle and regroup according to that need? I think at the moment that debate is still immature. We really don't know which would give us the best effect, given our resource dimension. I think we'd all like a specialist unit, but in terms of resources, medics are familiar, dedicated helicopters or not. It's the same thing. What's the best way to do this? I'd love one. Do I think it's realistic? I'm not sure. I don't see the resource environment, regardless of political complexion in the future, necessarily being any easier than it currently is. We're going to have to reorganise the way we do things. And that's the difficulty. There's lots of sacred cows around here, and there's only one slaughterhouse.
Question 6. You talked about doctrine and concepts coming first, and then building capability to deal with these things. Do we have that doctrine, and do we know the capability we want to achieve, or are we approaching it from another direction?
I think we're doing it the other way around. We're actually still at the conceptual stage. We haven't yet got to the stage of writing doctrine. A pretty clear view of, I have anyway, where I'd like to go. But the concept is still to be agreed. You are now part of that debate. What is it we see ourselves doing in the future? What are our respective components going to look like? And within that, where will we sit? And there's a subplot here. What will the Defence Medical Services look like in the future? That's a separate thing. And it does beg a few questions. I'm confident we are going the right way around. The Army Development Forum was a conceptual, blue sky, no limits view. What is it we're looking at in the future? Now that's what we have to do. We've now come from that stage to the next stage, where we're trying to firm that up, to condense that, to distill those views into some principles from which will flow a concept paper. And once that concept paper is agreed, we can go to the next stage, which is doctrinal development. Unfortunately, while we're doing that, we are faced with the realities of what's going on now in the battle space. And so I think you will have a bottom-up element as we get things right and we get things wrong on the ground, and we will, and we develop that. So we've started that top-level stuff. I think we are inching towards that lower-level stuff. And perhaps that's not a bad way to do this. But you won't get resources until you've got that conceptual piece absolutely nailed down and agreed to, because that's what will drive the RP community. And I think that's right, because that's your intellectual foundation for this.
Question 7. Our thinking is probably aligned with the US, but what about our other NATO partners? Are we all going through a similar process at the moment?
There are some NATO allies who are very close to what we're saying, and there are others who do not and will not sign up to it. Well, that may define for you the allies of the future in these sort of operations, because those who don't sign up to this may have limited utility, frankly. They may have. Or we may have to fold in different elements of the force from them, which won't include medical. It may not include other things. People are very keen to give logistic support. And certainly when I went into Kabul, I ended up with a platoon full of different hospitals, which as much as a chocolate fire guard, frankly. So that's quite popular because it minimises your risk and yet increases political influence. But I suspect that NATO itself is feeling its way through this. And we'll have to see what effect perhaps the relocation of the Ark has on this whole debate. What is the nature of the Ark in the future? What about the other NATO 3-star headquarters? What does it mean for them? Are they genuine war-fighting headquarters? Are they suited for major combat operations? Or is it really just a peacekeeping role that they can comfortably take on board? Big, big questions. I hope what I've done here is to make the point that I believe that MED is a capability. It has a synergy. What it can never be is divorced from the strategy, from the campaign plan. It's part of it. And you cannot stand outside of that. You need to be fully engaged in it.
Please note that the views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect official thinking and policy of either Her Majesty's Government or the Ministry of Defence. Major General Alan Hawley can be contacted by email at dgams, spelt Delta Golf Alpha Mike Sierra, at amd, spelt Alpha Mike Delta, .eclipse.co.uk.